All right, so what if the political movements that are shaping our world, what if they weren't actually driven by ideology, but instead by a really deep psychological suffering that's caused by modern life itself? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dive into a pretty controversial theory that makes exactly that claim. We'll break down its arguments step by step.
So the entire theory we're looking at today, it's all built on this one pretty radical claim. I mean, this is the starting point for everything that follows. The argument is you just can't understand the psychology of modern political rebellion, not really, unless you first accept that the system itself is the real root of the problem. Okay, so before we can even get to the politics, we have to get our heads around the diagnosis, right? The theory starts by arguing that our modern, industrial, technological system, well, it's doing a very specific kind of psychological damage to all of us.
Now, according to the source, the real problem with our industrial system isn't something external, like pollution or waste. Nope, it's internal. It's all about how the system messes with a really fundamental and totally essential human drive.
And the source has a name for this. It's called the power process. You know that feeling, right? That sense of satisfaction you get when you set a goal, you put in the work, and you finally achieve it. Well, this whole cycle, the theory argues, isn't just a nice to have. It's absolutely fundamental to our psychological health.
And this is where we get to the core of the problem. When society takes care of all our basic needs, but in doing so, it kind of strips away our autonomy, it takes away our chance to chase after meaningful goals, well, it completely short-circuits that power process. The result, according to this theory, it's a widespread feeling of powerlessness, of frustration, just deep psychological suffering. Okay, so if this psychological suffering is happening all over the place, how does it actually show up? This is the exact point where the theory connects that broken power process to what it calls the psychology of modern leftism. And it's important to note, it presents this psychology not as a cause of anything, but as a direct symptom of the system. The source claims this psychology is basically defined by two main tendencies. First, something it calls feelings of inferiority, and second, a concept called over-socialization. We're going to break down each of these, one by one.
All right, let's kick things off with that first psychological pillar of the theory, this idea of a deep-seated inferiority complex.
So the source uses this phrase, feelings of inferiority, as kind of a catch-all term. We're not just talking about low self-esteem here. It's a whole bundle of psychological states, everything from powerlessness to guilt to actual self-hatred, that the theory claims ends up shaping an entire worldview.
And you can see here some of the specific behaviors the source claims are driven by this inferiority complex. It argues that this mindset leads to things like being hypersensitive or intensely identifying with groups that are seen as weak or defeated. And at the same time, it creates a hatred for anything seen as strong or successful. This, the text claims, is also why you see a preference for collectivism over individualism, because if you're feeling inferior, the only way to get a sense of power is to attach yourself to a huge movement. And this is a really crucial claim. The idea is that the motivation for this kind of activism, it isn't what it looks like on the surface. The source argues that social problems aren't the real cause. Instead, they're just a vehicle, a way to express a deep-seated hostility and to satisfy that frustrated need for power, the need that the normal power process just can't fulfill anymore. Okay, so that's the inferiority complex. But beyond that, the theory points to a second, totally distinct psychological tendency. And this is one it says is more common among intellectuals and the upper middle class. And this is that concept of over-socialization.
So what exactly is over-socialization? Well, think of it like this. It's when someone is so heavily conditioned by society's moral code that they literally can't think or behave in a way that goes against it without feeling this immense guilt. You're just constantly burdened by what you should be thinking and what you should be doing.
And the source has this really powerful metaphor to describe that feeling. It's like being on a psychological leash. It's that sense of being held back, unable to do what you truly want without feeling this wave of guilt or shame. It's like you're in this constant state of self-policing, of psychological restraint.
And this whole thing leads to a really interesting paradox. So, step one, the over-socialized person feels this desperate need to rebel, just so they can feel autonomous. But, step two, because they're so conditioned, the rebellion has to stay inside the lines of society's accepted morality. So what do? They just accuse society of failing to live up to its own values. Which means, step three, the ultimate goal isn't really revolution. The source argues it's actually about integrating everyone even more deeply into the system's values, essentially reinforcing the very thing they say they're fighting against.
So where does all of this lead? What's the end game? Well, in its final section, the theory makes a pretty startling prediction about the ultimate goal of a movement that's driven by this kind of psychology.
Okay, to get this prediction, we need one last key term: surrogate activity. So remember that power process we talked about? Well, when real, meaningful goals just aren't available, people will invent artificial ones, just to have something to aim for, to feel that sense of purpose. And the source argues that for the modern leftist, political activism becomes the ultimate surrogate activity.
And this table here really pulls the whole argument together. The source claims that because this psychology is collectivist, it wants to organize all of society. And because it's fundamentally driven by a need for power, it's never going to give up the most powerful tool for social control there is: technology. In fact, technology is seen as absolutely essential for managing society on a massive scale.
And all of this leads to the source's final, pretty stark conclusion. It argues that because this drive for power is being channeled into these surrogate activities, goals that can never ever be fully satisfied, the movement itself becomes this kind of insatiable, almost religious force, one that will inevitably try to impose this morality on every single aspect of life.
And so that leaves us with one last, pretty provocative question, one that comes directly from the logic of the source material itself. If the goals of this activism are really just surrogate activities, designed to satisfy a psychological need, can they ever lead to the kind of fundamental, system-level change that a real revolution would require? It's definitely a challenging thought to end on.